Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar. I'm Dory Larson, Senior Electric Transportation Program Manager at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, or SACE. Over the next hour, Nick Nigro, the founder of Atlas Public Policy, and Stan Cross, Electric Transportation Policy Director with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, will cover our highlights from our sixth annual Transportation Electrification in the Southeast report released last week. A couple of technical items. We have saved time at the end of the webinar to answer questions. So during the presentation, you can submit questions by clicking on the Q&A box and typing your question. We do have quite a few attendees on the webinar today, so if your question does not get answered, please reach out to us following the webinar, and we'll provide contact information in the webinar follow-up email. And following the webinar, we will send a link to the recording. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Nick and Stan.
Thank you, Dory, and thank you everybody attending today's webinar. Really excited to be talking about this report and welcome Nick Nigro. It's great to be here with you to share findings from our sixth annual report that we've done together.
Always great to see you, Stan, and really grateful for the opportunity for us to continue our collaboration. It feels like we're going to need to have a celebratory birthday party soon for this report because it's going to starting to get old. It's in kindergarten now, and soon it's going to be all the way into high school. Who knows?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Well, it's always fun, to work with your team at Atlas Public Policy and to really just dive into this data. So Reed, if you want to bring to the next slide. So I just want to say on the sort of outset to folks attending today's webinar and those who will be listening to it as a recording, there's a lot to unpack in this report, with nuanced sections on private sector investments in jobs, sales and charging, utility investments, and public funding. So I highly recommend folks read the report to get all the juicy data, trends, and narrative details. It's well worth your time. For this webinar, Nick and I will focus on EV battery and supply chain investments and jobs because the Southeast continues to lead the nation by far. And it's a really important thing to be looking at when we think about electric transportation here in the Southeast. We'll also dive in a little bit to the EV sales and market share data because that is always on everyone's mind. And then we're going to talk a little bit about charging station deployment. And since battery range and access to chargers are top barriers to widespread consumer and fleet EV adoption. So to get us rolling, Nick, I want to do a little bit of market contextualization, right?
Hmm.
There's, you know, the this data is focused in on the Southeast, but obviously this is a global market with a lot going on worldwide in this space. So if you could help kind of just set the frame for what we're going to be talking about today, how are EVs selling globally, and what do you see driving kind of that global demand?
It's an important question, Stan. I'm glad we're starting at the top, really, because what you see a lot in the media, especially in the United States, is the back and forth between EVs being unpopular, EVs being unpopular, in vogue, out of vogue, etc. But when you step up to the look at the planet view, what you see is that EVs are really unstoppable at this point. They make up the majority of sales in the largest market, China. In total, we're expecting Chinese buyers to purchase nearly 14 million EVs this year, which, for context, that is as big as the US market for all vehicles. And globally, we can expect nearly 20 million EV sales this year, or about 1 in 4 vehicles purchased will be electric this year. That's more than twice the adoption rate of the United States. And I think that's really important whenever we're talking about transportation electrification. It's not a niche market. It is by far the mainstream in many markets around the world, including the biggest in China. And so whenever we're looking at thinking about what the future is, where risks we face when it comes to economic opportunity around the automotive sector, we have to recognize that the entire world is moving to EVs at a much more rapid pace than we are.
It is really interesting to zoom out to that global view and recognize that, a lot of the manufacturing, that we'll talk about here in a moment that's happening in this country, whether it's domestic automakers or foreign automakers who have onshored their manufacturing here in the US. For auto companies to compete, they are competing in a global market, and how, the US responds to that transition globally is going to be a really interesting thing for us to be watching over the coming years. So thinking about that sort of global landscape, drill down a little bit more and talk a little bit about how sort of the US market is shaping up in comparison to that, and then sort of how sort of the Southeast market is stacking up.
Sure. And so when you drill down into the United States market, we're certainly stronger than we've ever been when it comes to the purchase of electric vehicles, exceeding 8% market share in the last year. And even this year to date, despite all the headlines, the market is actually up year to date, year over year. It's not up a lot; it's up about 6%, but it's notable considering where I think the sort of the temperature is in the everyday consumer about where EVs are today. When you go further down into the Southeast, what you'll see is effectively some leaders and some laggards. Florida continues to be above the national average in terms of its market share, but most of the rest of the Southeast is either at or below.
Yeah, well, we'll dig into that here in a moment, but let's first read. If you would take us to slide 4, let's start with
Mm,
talking about, what's happening in manufacturing investments here in the region. I mean, as we said at the top, the Southeast continues to punch above its weight class. The region has about 18% of the nation's population and about
mhm,
33% of the nation's EV-related manufacturing investments and about 37% of the jobs, which is quite staggering and
mhm.
something that's really been happening just since we've been, reporting on this market together. And your Atlas has noted that most of the $79 billion in investments and 75,000 anticipated jobs have been generated since the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act during the Biden administration. So help remind us how those policies catalyzed the region's EV economic boom, and how sort of those manufacturing and consumer incentives were sort of tied together to really support the sort of onshoring of the market.
Yeah, super important question, especially now when we're looking back in the rearview mirror about what the last 5 years looked like. But before I get into that, I just want to make sure everybody in the audience understands that of the top 4 states who have investments in manufacturing of EVs and batteries and such, 3 of them are in the Southeast: Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Michigan is slightly in the lead overall in the country, which probably comes as no surprise to most folks. But the next 3 states are all in the Southeast, which is not just a trend in electric vehicles, it's a trend in the auto industry more generally. Increasingly, automakers are looking to the Southeast to build and deploy their vehicles. When you look at this chart, I really think it's interesting because what you see is this big jump in 2022 and 2023, which is basically follows the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Law, and then a steep decline in 24, and then an actual technically a net negative in 2025. So looking at this, you might say, oh, well, the federal government's policy signal drove all of this. And while it's true, it certainly did drive some of the investment. We have public statements from companies that were effectively saying, we're doing this investment either now or more quickly than we would have because of incentives at the federal level through the form of tax credits and such. But a lot of these investments, some companies were saying at the time that they were going to happen with or without this federal incentive. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier. The entire globe is moving to electrification. If the US is going to have an auto industry in the future, we have to have a really robust electric vehicle manufacturing base. And what the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Law, and even the OBBB signaled to the market that if EVs are going to be purchased by Americans, ideally they're built with as much domestic content as possible. And so there were specific provisions within the Inflation Reduction Act, tax incentives that encouraged domestic onshoring of manufacturing. And some of those were continued with the OBBB, the law that was enacted by Republican-controlled White House and Congress over the summertime.
Yeah, I mean it's really good to note that there is some continuity with the one big beautiful bill and the bills of the Biden administration. But I think it's important to note, and we can go to the next slide, that we're seeing the rollbacks of many of those
Hmm.
incentives, most notably the EV tax credits that are sunsetting at the end of the month, and also some manufacturing incentives. And as you were saying, those consumer tax credits were sort of tied to what was sort of driving manufacturing. In order for your brand or your models to qualify for those EV tax credits and your dealers to be able to sell those to consumers, you had to have certain content of those vehicles assembled here in the US, certain content coming from US or most favored nation trade
Hmm.
countries. And so there was a real driver there. And Reed, if
Yeah.
you go to the next slide, we'll see that, regionally, this kind of gets at what you were saying about some of those top states and jobs, and we're starting to see some sort of a retraction going on.
Hmm.
You talked a little bit,
Yeah.
like how do you see in a little bit more detail this sort of political flip-flopping,
Yeah.
potentially impacting, and where do you see, the most pain being felt, in the market as we
Yeah.
have this sort of flip-flop event?
It's really hard to cut through the headlines because anytime you see a factory being canceled in the greater than $1 billion sort of level, as was done by Aspen Aerogels and AEC and well, Aspen Aerogels in Georgia, $670 million facility, and AESC, excuse me, in South Carolina, a $1.5 billion facility. These sound huge and they are meaningful. You can see the totals, it's well over 1,000 jobs that have been canceled in the last several months. Uh, the question that we have to ask as analysts is that because of what Congress just did, or was that just the normal cycle of business? When you go back to that chart that we were looking at before, there's huge jumps in manufacturing investments as the companies were trying to build a domestic based supply chain. There's no way that that trend was going to be able to continue well into the future and keep growing because it would have swallowed the entire auto industry. There was no doubt there was going to be a natural slowdown as the manufacturing that was announced was being built and came online. And there would eventually be some failures because that's the normal course of business. The question we need to keep in mind as we look ahead is how many of these potential cancellations that are happening now and into the future are because of federal policy or just because of the normal cycle of business. And to be frank, it's way too soon to tell. If I had to put my money on it, a lot of these cancellations that we've seen this year, whether we're talking about electric vehicles or batteries, were just going to happen anyway. The timelines might have been brought in because the numbers no longer look as good because those incentives are being pulled back in many cases. But again, it's kind of still a little bit too early to tell.
Yeah, it'll be something to watch for sure with huge
Mm-hmm.
impacts here to the southeast. So a lot of these investments in EVs and batteries, particularly in Georgia, North Carolina, were the largest economic development projects ever in the history of those states. So we're
Mm-hmm.
talking really, really big investments, and the states worked really hard and continue to work really hard to attract those businesses.
Yeah, and one of those just broke ground today.
They did. They
So
did.
Rivian's facility in Georgia just broke ground today. And so, when you're thinking about, what's at stake here, a lot is at stake. Thousands and thousands of jobs, the future of the auto industry for sure. 80% of the facilities that we tracked in the Southeast are already operating in some capacity or undergoing active construction. So a lot of these facilities are going to be completed, they're going to be operating, but then we got to ask the key question: is there going to be demand? Are we going to be able to get to full production at these facilities? And that's going to be largely up to the consumer at this point.
Yeah, agree. Well, that's a great segue to the next slide. And we can sort of start talking a little bit about sales and market share here. Because as you noted at the top, the region has seen in continued growth, as has the country.
Mm-hmm.
But here in the
Mm-hmm.
Southeast, we've seen 38% annual year-over-year growth in electric vehicle sales and have inched over that 8%
Mm-hmm.
market share threshold, which is really good news. And we're seeing the end of the, consumer tax credits coming, and, on everyone's mind, just as you were noted, is that uncertainty, what's going to happen. It's obviously too early to tell. But what we do know is that when we look at adoption of electric vehicles, sticker price remains a top barrier
Mm-hmm.
for consumers and fleet operators, even though owning an EV is much cheaper over time with the reduced cost of electricity compared to gasoline and reduced maintenance. But as you're looking at the data as closely as you and your teams do, kind of what are your thoughts on what's driving continued consumer interest in purchasing of EVs, and how like do you think that we're at a point where there's enough momentum and enough market maturity, EVs have been normalized enough where we might be able to move through this loss of the tax credits and continue to see growth in the sector?
Let me take that last part first because I think that's the most important part. And the answer is yes, of course, we're going to go towards full electrification at some point. It's the timing that matters the most, especially when it comes to the future of the industry. Obviously, if you're building a giant factory, you want to get it coming as fast as possible so you can earn a return on the investment you just put in to build that thing. And so the more vehicles you're selling, the more likely it is you're going to get to that return more quickly at this point. And so, eventually we're going to get there. It's just whether or not we're going to be able to carry all the companies that are trying to operate in this country with us. Because I think, if you fast forward 5 to 10 years from now and you see the world rapidly approaching mainstream electrification in most markets, and you look at where we are as the United States, we have to be competitive. And Americans are eventually going to look abroad and say, why can't I buy that cheap Chinese electric vehicle? And why am I stuck with this $30,000 to $40,000 combustion engine vehicle? Now, to get to your point about the other part of your question, why do people like EVs? Whether you're talking about that cheap Chinese electric vehicle or you're talking about a brand new Chevy Equinox or a Tesla Model S, it's because the vehicle is the best option for the consumer. It has the best performance. It has adequate range. It has all the tech features that people look for, all the creature comforts that you look for. These are very competitive vehicles on a case-by-case basis. They can win out on the dealer lots. What will be the test for the near term in particular is what happens once that $75 incentive goes away. Many are thinking, oh, it's going to crash the EV market. But if you look at the data, probably about less than half of the vehicles that were being sold in the last year even qualified for the credit. So a lot of vehicles were being purchased by Americans without the credit in place. Maybe it got them to the dealer, or maybe it helped them get more aware of EVs, but they were purchasing vehicles without the incentive. And so there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the EV market's still going to be strong after the incentive, but it's clear also that that timeline to electrification is now going to be stretched out a bit and puts more pressure on the industry to quickly get to cost parity and eventually cost reductions so that they can offer EVs at an even lower price than they are today.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too that, EV leases are currently outcompeting internal combustion engine leases on price. So
Mhm.
when we look at the new car purchasing through that lease lens where lots of activity is happening, we are at parity in large part because
Mhm.
of the current tax credit. And I think it's also really interesting to note that we're seeing a real run on EVs right now as consumers see those tax credits dwindling. And I won't be surprised if we see a record-shattering, third quarter of sales here in the US as a result. But I think that that's really important, both recognizing that a lot of people are leasing their first EV, as I did back in 2013, but they're getting
And
it.
I did in
Yeah,
21.
yeah, perfect. And so and like, we see in the data that when consumers kick gas and go to an EV, very few come back. So as we're seeing this sort of run on electric vehicles, we are also, seeing that momentum carry forward. We're going to have more folks with EVs whose friends and families are learning about the benefits of EVs, and you can kind of see a catalyst that comes out of this sort of rush at the end of the tax
Mhm.
credits that becomes almost a market stimulus in and of itself. So it's going to be really interesting to watch that.
Yeah, if I could just build a little bit on that point, because I do
Go
want
for
to,
it.
be clear-eyed about what's going to happen in the near term. You know, this credit's going to go away. It's going to make it tougher for some vehicles to be sold, for sure. How that companies react to that, whether they do more aggressive pricing or squeeze more cost out of the production so they can drop pricing, that's pretty much on them. There is some other countervailing forces that put pressure on EVs in addition to the positive ones that you mentioned, and that's the low price of gasoline. We've got a pretty low price relative to to where gasoline has been in the past. And that's a key driver of EV adoption. As you mentioned earlier, you can save a lot of money by driving electric, but it's as gasoline continues to stay as a relatively low price and the fuel economy of some of these vehicles gets higher, there's that price savings is being squeezed a bit. And so we have to pay very close attention to that too, because many cost conscious consumers aren't just looking at the sticker price, they're also looking at the price to own. And if you can save a lot of money with an EV, that's the way to go. But if you don't, then it's going to be harder to make that sale.
Yep. Good point. Good point. Well, let's go to the next slide. And we, when we think about the Southeast, right, we're talking about sales. And one of the things that
Mm-hmm.
we track is market share, right, which is the
Mm-hmm.
percentage of new vehicles purchased that are EVs. And that's a really important trend line to watch, right? Because that takes into account things that are happening in the market in general. And what we're seeing here in the Southeast is really sort of this story of almost three markets within the
Yeah.
region, right? You've got Florida doing what Florida is doing, which is quite staggering, just continuing to grow now even above the nation's average market share. And you see North Carolina and Georgia kind of running neck and neck as they've been. And then you've got South Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee kind of trending near each other down at the bottom of the region. And there's we've looked at the data and there's really no clear indicator as to why the region's split in this way. There aren't clear policy advantages in one state over another, regulatory advantages in one state over another. But it's kind of interesting to see the region kind of splitting in this way. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is there anything that I'm missing that could explain why we're seeing this?
No, I think that what you're looking at is a reflection of market dynamics that exist in other parts of the country as well. Certain states that share a lot of overlap and commonality in many ways don't share the same level of adoption for EVs, and that there's often an explanation for that. As you alluded to, many of these states that are the most leading states for EVs are because they've had policy in place. A big example of that is the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation that was started in California and followed by several other states. Those tended to be the leading states. But as you mentioned, Florida is right above there. It's above average. Texas is also a leading EV state. And when you drill into that, it's like, well, what's the story there? And you look at the data, and it's basically the same kind of the people in Florida and some of the more leading states that aren't policy driven states. The people are buying the same EVs that are most popular nationally. It's basically a reflection of the vehicles are winning on the lots. So
Mhm.
if you look at the top vehicles in Florida, it's the Tesla Model Y, it's the Chevy Equinox EV. These are the same vehicles that are most popular nationally. It's those EVs are competing well on a case by case basis. And there's a Florida is a very unique place for a lot of reasons, but it's very attractive for EVs. It's very flat, it's very warm, it's very conducive to electric vehicles because you get a lot more predictability over the range of the vehicle, and so that certainly helps. But at the end of the day, I just think these EVs are competing well. And you mentioned earlier the sort of network effects, right? You talk to your friends, and they talk to their friends. They're clearly having positive experiences down there in Florida with EV ownership.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's great to see that consumers in general are having really positive experience with EVs. I mean, I think that's a really important thing to note. I think one of the stats we don't track here, but you can look at it in other places from surveys that are done, just both the interest from the consumer side in EVs. We keep seeing really strong interest in the 30s to low 40% in considering or seriously considering EVs for their next purchase. And then we're also seeing really strong desire for EV owners to stick with EVs long
Mm-hmm.
term. And I think those are indicators to your point of what's, competing on the lot. And
Yep.
as we think about, if we go to the next slide, we started tracking, EV sales on the commercial side as well. And this is a much smaller market right now than we see on the passenger vehicle side. But nonetheless, it's an important market. This is where a lot of fleet adoption is happening. This is where the economics of owning and operating EVs has a very different impact on the bottom line of a business versus the bottom line of a family on the personal vehicle side. Um, so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what you see happening in the Southeast in this sort of commercial vehicle market, and kind of what are the kinds of vehicles and use cases that are, gaining the most traction right now for electrification.
Well, the chart is great because it really highlights, who the winner is at this point, and it's the, Rivian's delivery van that folks might have seen, carrying their Amazon goods. More than 4,600 were sold in the region in the last 12 months. In total, when you look at that chart, four vehicles made up 90% of the sales, and these are all small, class two through class six kind of medium duty vehicles, delivery vans and such. And the reason that those are so successful is because they're the best use cases for electrification right now. It's mostly vehicles that are being driven around town. They drive less than a few hundred miles a day, so range isn't a challenge for them. And because, as you mentioned at the outset, you have a potential for a really low operating cost, that's very attractive to a private company who has to really squeeze as much cost savings as possible in order to be competitive when it comes to freight delivery. And so I think that what's interesting about a market like commercial vehicles is once that tipping point has been reached, you're going to get to mass adoption much more quickly because it's going to be about business competitiveness. Of course, there are other rationale for purchasing electric vehicles, like, oh, this runs quieter, the delivery drivers love it, they have no problems with it, or this is great for the community because there's fewer emissions, or it's a much quieter driving experience, so less noise in the roadway and in our cities. Those are all key facets for the general public, of course, for all of us to appreciate. But the businesses at the end of the day, they got to save money, and it's a good sign that you're seeing a lot more delivery vehicles, because that's a lot of what our economy is going on right now is delivering and packaging of these goods in these short distance moves, and seeing more and more of these commercial electric vehicles on the road is certainly a good sign for EVs.
Agree, agree. I think another good sign too is the uptick in school bus electrification. We see Daimler and Bluebird on the list. Daimler's the owns Thomas built buses, which has been doing a lot
Mhm.
of the school bus electrification as well. And that's been a really great use case to see take off because I think, like your point about the delivery vans, electrifying school buses is another no-brainer when it comes to the technology is ready and capable, to do the job today. And it saves a lot of money for school districts and also, helps keep kids and communities safer by eliminating those diesel emissions that surround, a diesel school bus. So let's jump to talking about charging infrastructure
Yeah.
here, right? And I think the big story in the Southeast, continues to be the steady growth of high speed, what we call direct current fast chargers or DCFC. The region saw a 41% increase this past year, and Alabama, who we saw earlier kind of lagging in EV adoption, led the region with an 81% increase. You see their line just kind of jump right to the top of the pack with the deployment of DC fast chargers. So if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between the growth in DCFC, these fast chargers, and EV adoption in the Southeast, and kind of how these two technologies work together.
So this is a really interesting point because you were mentioning earlier about some of the lessons that we've been learning as we've been going in this marketplace. And I think the charging experience is something that has now become front and center for not just the charging providers, because it should have always been for them, but now for the OEMs as well, the automakers. They know that charging experience is going to drive sales. And so what you saw in the last few years is all of the automakers have switched to using the Tesla charging port, so they get soon, either already or soon, will get access to the Tesla supercharging network. And you've also seen significant investments from OEMs directly in the United States, which is really a first, whether it be GM Energy or Iona, which is based in the Southeast in North Carolina. And these investments in fast charging are really about overcoming one of the biggest hurdles that people have ever cited when it comes to why they don't want to buy an EV. And it's like, I can't go to where I want to go, or I don't know how I'm going to refuel if I'm going to take that long trip. And whether or not that's a rational economic decision because you're only doing it a couple times a year, doesn't matter. It's still a driver. And what we saw in a few years ago in the news was a lot of bad stories about charging experiences. Saw some negative press, essentially, where, reporters were out trying to do road trips. There was even one in the Southeast, if I recall correctly, where the experience was not great. And what's a sort of capping of that, or a sort of positive way of looking at that, is it drove the industry to improve itself. And what we've seen is considerably more reliable charging experience and much smoother charging experience. And now a consolidation on the port, the type of plug that's used for fast charging. And I think we're going to end up in a better spot. So it's an example where sunshine did result in a more positive experience. And I think that that's one of the reasons we're seeing more growth in the Southeast.
Yeah, and I think it's always important to note whenever we're talking about EV charging that, 80+% of charging happens at home. And
Mm-hmm.
as an EV driver for the last 12 years, charging my EV is the most convenient and reliable experience imaginable most of the time, right? I come home,
Mm-hmm.
I plug in, I go to sleep, I wake up, my car's full. It is
Mm-hmm.
easy and it is cost effective because
Mm-hmm.
electricity is so cheap at home. And so these DC fast chargers are necessary. When I go on a road trip, I am using these fast chargers to facilitate that road trip. But they're also a marker of progress, as you're saying. And I think so for consumers who haven't gotten an EV yet, understanding that if you've got access to home charging, you've got most of your charging already figured out. And the growth in these fast chargers really does help alleviate the perception that an EV can't do all the things you need it to do, because it
Mm-hmm.
actually can and is increasingly more able to do so as these chargers get deployed. And I think the other important thing, we can go to the next slide, is that, in the report, we also track what we call level two chargers, right? Those
Mm-hmm.
slower charging stations that are at your destinations, that are at your hotels, your shopping centers, your attractions, your state parks, etc., to help support the whole charging experience. And there's a real relationship, right? We focus a lot on the fast chargers because that's exciting. But these level two chargers are kind of just as important, right? Because as this market grows, these fast chargers are going to get more and more pressure put on them. And if you are also deploying these more cost effective in terms of just cheaper to install level two chargers at destinations, they're supporting those fast chargers. They're basically taking some of the pressure off of those fast chargers. So could you talk a little bit more about sort of the importance of that whole EV charging ecosystem and why we need to not only be focusing on the fast chargers, but also these level two ports?
Yes, of course. I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the reliance on slower charging. That's not just good for you as a consumer, because it costs a lot less money to deliver electrons slowly than it costs to deliver them quickly. It's also better for the electrical grid in general, because for the same similar reason. And so the extent, and of course, it's also good for your battery in your vehicle. So the more you can charge slowly while your car is parked and you're not really doing anything anyway, the better off everybody is. And so there is always going to be a case for level two charging. It's just with increased amount of range, people are going to be looking more for let's say less frequent opportunities to charge, ideally when they're home or when they're on a long journey. And that makes it a little bit challenging for some early day business cases for level two charging, where basically you had a 100-mile EV and you would always want to be plugging in to go anywhere. When you have a 300-mile EV, you're probably not as willing to pay for electric vehicle charging in the public as you were before when you're on a short trip. And so that's going to result in some evolution in the way that the charging services are looked at. It's just part of the reason I think you're seeing so much attention on fast charging and a sort of a more not luxurious, but frankly, just a better charging experience while you're doing those fast charging, because people are looking at that as where that's likely where they're going to get most of the public charging in the long term. And that might be the best business opportunity. And then the last thing I want to mention, because I'd be remiss if I didn't, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, otherwise known as NEVI, was funded in the infrastructure law back in 21. This was a $5 billion single largest investment in charging in US history. Uh, for the most part, it's gotten a lot of attention because it rolled out very slowly. There's a lot of reasons for that. But what is clear is that the Southeast, along with the rest of the country, has seen hundreds and hundreds of awards for these fast charging ports to be deployed in key centers, travel centers that weren't necessarily going to be accommodated by the private sector on their own. This is one of the critical examples of where government and the private sector come together to address a real gap, building that sort of backbone of charging infrastructure that is needed for the infrastructure for EVs, I should say. And the last point I want to make on this is Florida. Where are you? You've got to get off the dime. Florida, of all the states in the country, is falling the furthest behind and taking advantage of these federal dollars. And I just encourage the state to use it while it's available, because you got a really great EV market there, and I'm sure a lot of people would appreciate having more fast chargers available for them to use.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really interesting dynamic charging is. I mean, because on one hand, the electrical grid is ubiquitous, right? There are electrons to tap into just about everywhere. And we have the technology to do so and deliver that power to the cars, but you really got to do some good planning. You've got to leverage government and private sector support. You've really got to, it's an all hands on deck. If we're going to get a nationwide deployment of charging infrastructure, everybody's got to play a role in that effort. But it is something that can be done thanks in part to having already laid out this electric grid, across the country. So we got that backbone to build this backbone on.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, let's go ahead and jump to the next slide, and we're just going to pause here for a moment and before we go to Q&A. So thanks, folks who are putting questions in the
Yeah, I
Q&A.
see a lot of questions already. Great.
Yeah, we'll be hitting those in just one second. But kind of as we tee up to sort of talk about that Q&A, as
Mm-hmm.
we've been talking about, Nick, we're clearly at a market inflection point, with both sort of the disruption of, the policies that were geared towards supporting the market, but also the disruption we're seeing in the technology side with so many
Mm-hmm.
EVs selling globally and a lot of desire
Mm-hmm.
happening here. So like if you're looking forward, kind of what are the one or two things you're going to be watching over the next 6 to 12 months that are going to give you a sense as to where this market is moving now that we've had this political flip-flop and are entering kind of this new moment with adoption here in the US?
There's increasing pressure on the industry. I've said this now a couple times. There's also increasing pressure to some extent on state and local governments. They stand to benefit a lot from electrification, particularly the places that are building factories. And so there is some pressure on them to react to this. The federal government has taken a step back. The consumer credit has been expired, but it's important to note that the battery tax credit 45X is still in place. And it will be in place for the duration of what it was intended to be through the Inflation Reduction Act. So there is a signal that Washington wants a battery industry in this country. It's just not exactly clear where we're going to put all those batteries. And so what I'm going to be watching really closely is the uptick in battery manufacturing in this country and how those factories are operating and filling their book. Recently, Panasonic opened the single largest investment in Kansas's history to build batteries. We've got huge investments in Georgia with Hyundai and others, and in North Carolina with Toyota. These are all big battery manufacturing facilities. Where are they all going to go? They're going to clearly, a lot of them are going to go into EVs, but they're going to increasingly go into grid storage, maybe even hybrid applications. So that's one thing I'm going to be looking at. The other one is just how is the industry responding when it comes to price and offerings. So General Motors and Ford both made a lot of made a lot of noise, I should say, when they announced that they're going to be ready to launch a new battery chemistry, essentially, that's going to make EVs considerably more affordable. And when companies like that, particularly GM, when they said the date in which they were going to be launching these vehicles, that's something that does not happen easily. They are not just writing a tweet about what they think is going to happen tomorrow. They are really committed to being able to deliver this product. And when we see that happen, which is about a couple years away, that's when I'm going to be looking for real mass push by GM and other automakers to really try to sell these vehicles. It's easy to see that we've seen growth in the EVs over the last several years in the United States, but still a lot of that was driven by policy, whether it be the California Zero Emission Vehicle Program or some of the federal incentives. What's going to happen now is we're going to have to see a lot more of it driven by the industry. And the extent to which these companies step up to deliver there is really kind of on them at this point.
Agree, agree. And I think those are two great things to watch. I think the third that I would add to that list is looking at that consumer desire. So, JD
Hmm.
Power, Cox Automotive, Consumer Reports, they all do surveys on consumer desire. And I'm going to be watching to see how those numbers are impacted, and whether they stay strong and whether that consumer desire remains at a place where the automakers can feel increasingly confident that if they do deliver on their pledges to move this market along, they're going to be met with consumers that are interested in what they bring to the showroom.
Hmm.
All right, well, let's jump into Q&A. So if we want to jump to the next slide, and then Dory, if you want to jump back on and shoot some questions our way.
Sounds good. All right. So thank you for your thoughts thus far. We got quite a few questions coming in. So the first one is from Zachary Turner from WFAE. He's asking, have Southern states passed any laws that put artificial constraints on EV adoption that make them less competitive?
Do you want me to take a stab at that
Yeah,
first,
why
Nick?
don't you go first? I'll jump in.
So, Zach, I'd say, I mean, in the Southeast states, we've seen, EV fees and taxes imposed to make sure that where the states are capturing gas tax that are lost by folks charging up their car instead of filling up their car. And I think it's really important. I think all of us in the industry agree that EV drivers need to pay their fair share, that we need to be paying for the roads and bridges we're using, just like folks who are driving internal combustion engines, full
Hmm.
stop. That being said, we have seen some rates set that are far beyond what folks are paying in a gas tax. So in a sense, EV drivers are being taxed more. And I think Georgia is a prime example of that, where EV drivers are being taxed a significantly more money annually than they would be if they were driving a gas car. So that's one example where in the Southeast, all except Florida, we have sort of these taxes in place. But I can't say how much that is sort of ultimately impacting the market. There's no clear correlation between those taxes and folks choosing not to buy an EV. I think more the top line story in the Southeast is that there's not policies in place to incentivize the market, which we see in other places. So it's really being left to, the market to do what it's going to do on its own. Do you have anything
Couldn't have
to
said
add
it
to
better
that?
myself, Stan.
Good
All
stuff.
right. So our next question is from Elizabeth Oates, and she's asking, how do rising electricity prices factor into the outlook
Mhm.
for EVs, especially combined with steady gas prices?
Yeah, so this was sort of what I was alluding to earlier when I talked about, historically, not very high gas prices. This is an era right now where gas is not as expensive as it has been, and we're at a time when electricity prices are rising. In the last couple of years, they've actually been rising faster than inflation. This puts a lot of pressure on the electric utility industry to address affordability issues in general. There's so much attention on grid capacity in order to satisfy data centers and other electrification needs. But we don't want to lose sight of the everyday person who has an electric bill that's going up a little bit too fast right now. And so that's something I'm going to be looking to policy makers to address, particularly in the Public Utility Commission side of things, those who are regulating the investor-owned utilities. We have to figure out ways of you know um, dampening the curve for increasing electricity costs, because it's not really just about electric vehicles, which it could certainly influence EV adoption. It's more about the everyday use of electricity that I'm most concerned about.
And I would just add that keep in mind that when we look at the trend line of electricity costs over time, it is incredibly price stable compared to the incredible volatility
Yes.
of gas prices. And so we may be at a point where gas prices are low, but we know that they're going to be high again. And meanwhile, electricity is still going to be growing, even though it's growing what would be feels like significantly now on the trend line is still a pretty steady
Yeah.
and flat growth.
And
And I think the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that here in the Southeast, we don't have any oil or gas production in the states that we cover in this report. So all of the gas and diesel that we use in the Southeast, we import into the Southeast. And about two-thirds of every dollar we spend on that gas and diesel leaves the Southeast for oil-rich states and countries. When we drive on electricity, that those dollars, it flips. Two-thirds of every dollar we spend on electricity stays in the region because we're generating it here and we're maintaining the system here. So there are a lot of different kind of economic and financial mechanisms at play, not just sort of the rising cost of electricity, but also the dynamics of that market versus, that of the gas and diesel market.
and I just want to reiterate the point I was trying to make earlier that I probably didn't make it very well is electricity prices are rising faster than inflation in the last few years. As Stan said, that's very unusual. They have not risen above inflation for a very long time. And so this is the unusual thing. And this is the sense of urgency, I think, that electric utilities face and policymakers face to address it. So you got to dampen that right away because that's not what people expect.
All right, thank you. Our next question is about EV to charger ratio. We talked about this a little bit already, but if you could elaborate, the question is, are there any thoughts on that ratio? Other countries have more public chargers and access to public transportation, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it's hard to look at any individual country and use it as a guide just because we're so unique in so many ways here in the United States. But that ratio is something that ebbs and flows as the market adopts or adapts to the changing conditions. I think to me, one thing that's going to put downward pressure on the need for charging is the increasing amount of range and the lowering cost of batteries. You know, I mentioned this earlier, but 15 years ago, the EVs averaged about 100 to maybe 150 miles of range. Tesla really kind of blew that out of the water with the Model S. But now, 10 years later, EVs are pushing 250, 300 miles of range in general. And so the need for public charging decreases. The real challenge in that is that there are some people like myself who live in urban environments where we don't have easy access to home charging. And so that is a potential bridge for and the need for more public charging, and it might end up putting upward pressure on that ratio. And so that's sort of what I mean by the market adapting. In the early days, you have a lot of people who have garages and easy access to home charging. Those are a lot of your early adopters, and that's going to put downward pressure on the ratio as you get to more people who have needs for public charging because they don't have adequate home charging reliably. That's going to put upward pressure on it. And so we're going to keep trying to figure out where the right point is. But as long as we have a good market regulation, a good market rules, I think we'll find that balance.
And I think something else to note on that here in the Southeast, we have a lot of local economies that are driven by tourism. And so a lot of the ratio of the charging may be as much to serve folks who are owning EVs in the community as it is to draw in and meet the needs of visitors who are driving EVs to your community. So I think that's another interesting dynamic that you'll see pop in some local markets where tourism is a really important part of the economy.
So let's keep with the theme of charging. This next question is from Austin Smith, who's asking, would it be possible to share some data about the rate of adoption and DCFC per 1,000 people with California removed? Because California itself kind of skews the national trend line. And he's saying that he thinks it would be helpful to view the nation as a whole without California to better show the adoption and charger availability.
I love the nerds on the webinar. I don't have that information off the top of my head, but if you send us an email afterwards, I'm happy to share that with you. Because I do agree that California is often an outlier. I will say though that it's increasingly not as much of an outlier because there are other states that have considerably high adoption rate, and they're catching up to California. Colorado last year had a higher adoption for a period than California. Washington is right up there too. Washington State, and also where I live in Washington, D.C., we're well over 20% as well, EV adoption. And so While it was true several years ago that California was out on its own, a lot of states have caught up.
All right, thank you for that. So this is a question about from David Ferris. This is coming in about what's recently been happening with the Hyundai plant. So any thoughts on how the deportations of Koreans from the Hyundai LG in Georgia and maybe elsewhere will affect EV and battery production?
I have some thoughts, Dan, but I don't want to jump on your
Yeah,
toes
no,
there if you want to say something.
I'll just say at the top, like I think, it's too early to tell and it's too difficult to get clarity on sort of both um the sort of impulse of what's going on in terms of immigration and also sort of its impact on plants, whether it's Hyundai or others. So I think stay tuned for that, David. But Nick, what do you want to add?
Yeah, I think that, there's a long history in the US when we're trying to do tech transfer and really essentially importing technology and processes and also exporting them. That, we bring in foreign workers who have that expertise to do the proper training of American workers or vice versa, sending Americans overseas to train local workers. I think that relationship is critically important to maintain, especially as we want to try to be, good global citizens and working with our partners in other countries, in South Korea and in Japan and in Europe and Germany, where we have a lot of major auto manufacturers who want to do more activity in the United States. We have to maintain really good relationships, and I'm sure that whatever's happening behind the scenes at the State Department and elsewhere is trying to make sure that there's uh, no long-term issues as a result of what happened down in Hyundai, in that facility. And I'm optimistic that that was a one-off.
Very good. Okay. So, switching to the cost of vehicles, this question comes from Kent Minalt, who's asking, a friend of mine bought a Hyundai Ioniq 5 that did not qualify for the tax credit. I know we've talked about this a
Yeah.
little bit. Nonetheless, Hyundai gave her the $7,500 off of the price. So, do you think manufacturers will continue to lower prices after October 1st?
You want to make a bet on that one, Stan?
Yeah, I'm gonna bet that they are. And I
Hmm.
think, I've been in the electric vehicle space and in the solar industry a little bit. And, when you have tax credits, right, that are benefiting consumers, it is common for some of the value of those tax credits to wind up in the margins of the companies producing the equipment,
No
using the
way.
technology, right? And so that is pretty much a given. And that's part of what the tax credit is about. It's about bringing new technology to market and supporting both the consumer, but also supporting the business. So I think a
Hmm.
big question on the table right now is how much of those credits, whether it was for passenger vehicles or like we were talking about the commercial vehicles, where you also have really large tax credits that have been available,
Hmm.
how much of those tax credits, as well as the grants that were there to support the purchase of some of these vehicles, thinking about electric school buses in particular, enabled companies to pull in a little bit more margin to help defray some of the cost that the R&D is kind of inflicting on them as they bring this new technology to market. If the answer to that is a significant amount of margin, then there's a lot of room for those companies to drop cost, right? And
Hmm.
I think that's what we're going to be watching over the course of this next 6 to 12 months, because it really is on the automaker or the bus maker or the van maker or the truck maker to go ahead and make these vehicles competitive if they want to keep customers coming.
Yeah. And I'll just add that, a lot of OEMs, they have production plans and such, and it's very expensive to change those plans. So the extent to which they're able to lose some of the margin in order to make sure that they meet the production goals that they had set out is going to be something that I'll watch in the immediate term after the credit expires. In addition, those firms that are well capitalized, long historic firms that aren't necessarily startups that have really easy access to low cost capital, they might choose to do some financing or other sorts of creative measures in order to keep the sticker prices at a place that looks like some of that tax credit is still in place. in order to drive sales. And, competition is a beautiful thing. If we see a couple do it, we might see more follow.
Let's hope for that. All right. Next question is about the transit and school buses, buying electric buses, and reliability. So this question, it's anonymous. It's says I've seen some concerns raised with reliability of these vehicles, essentially saying the EV buses are not available and to be used at a high percentage rate. Is this a real concern, or have these EV buses proven to be as reliable as the automobile EVs?
Well, let me kick off by just kind of breaking the two technologies apart, like sort of the transit bus and the school bus, because they really are two very different use cases. And I think on the electric school bus front, we're seeing just really good satisfaction among school districts that have brought electric school buses into their fleets. And if you want more information on that, follow up with us or go to our article section on our website, and you'll see a lot that we've written about those districts and the successes that they're having. So I think the reliability on the school bus side is certainly proving itself out. I think on the transit side, also, the reliability has been strong, and transit agencies have been increasingly electrifying and having good success doing that. However, I think it's a more complicated use case, and so it's just taking a little bit more to understand how to maximize the value of electric transit buses in your overall sort of transit fleet. Having said both those things, I think one challenge that we're seeing in both the electric school bus and the transit side of things is that there are companies that have folded in both spaces that have not been able to make it. And again, this has nothing to do with federal incentives or any of the government intervention. This is just the market doing what the market does. And so there is some kind of pain being felt as these companies transition out of the market and school districts or transit agencies figure out how to adjust accordingly with the technology that they've purchased. So I think that is definitely something that's there in the market. But I think as far as overall reliability, these vehicles, the buses, both school and transit, are doing a really good job.
Yeah. Let me just add real quick, just one suggestion that a real transit expert has raised to light for me anyway, and that is these markets, whether you're talking about school buses or transit buses or really kind of trucks in general, these are very small markets in the small thousands in a lot of cases, and therefore it's really hard to get to economies of scale. And therefore you really want to have as consistent a product as possible in your manufacturing it. And what you notice in a lot of transit bus situations is there's far too much customization that's going from one transit agency to another in order to accommodate a particular transit agency's desire, requirements and such. Getting those agencies to do more standardization around what a bus looks like and all that sort of thing will make it much more feasible for electric transit buses to be built in mass. And that is an opportunity for policy, particularly at the federal level, which controls a lot of the capital dollars that go into transit bus investments.
Thank you, guys. We're getting real close to the end. So the last statement here is it's a statement, not a question. And then I want to leave you guys with last thoughts, and then I'll close this out. So the statement is, in Georgia, we can expect energy costs to rise much faster than inflation based on Georgia Power IRP. That said, offsetting energy costs with solar and storage will tamp down some of this, at least for people in governments that can afford to put it in. So
Yeah, I
that was
mean,
a good point. And
yeah, good point. I think I'll just say that, again, having been driving EVs since 2013 and being a pure electric vehicle family, I mean, driving an EV compared to the gas cars that we replaced is saving us about $2,000 a year. And so that's real money in our pocket driving two EVs instead of two gas cars. And so there's that as well that kind of goes against some of those rising costs of electricity that we've been talking about and that you're mentioning in the statement. So I think it's always important to keep in mind that EVs do generate a lot of savings. And it's important that we do everything we can to make sure that all consumers have access to those savings.
Yeah, I'll just leave with it's exciting to hear, more people trying to get creative to try to control their own destiny. And when you that that's on the individual basis based on what you all were just sharing about that person. But we step it up to the national level, and we want to control our own destiny. We have to have a really strong electric vehicle market because the rest of the world is not going to wait. They're far past us at this point. We were catching up for a while. We slowed that down, and so now it's largely up to companies and to some extent state and local governments to start to fill in some of the gap that Washington has created in recent months so that we don't fall too far behind because really there's far too much at stake.
Well, thank you, Stan. Thank you, Nick, for your thoughts and this really insightful conversation. Thank you to everyone who attended today. We hope that you found the information interesting and informative. Please look out for an email from us with a link to the recording of this webinar, the corresponding blog post, and the report itself. And if you have any future or further questions, please feel free to reach out to our team following the presentation. And we've got contact information up on the screen right now so that we can follow up in an email. Thanks again for attending, everyone.
All
Have a
right.
great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody,
All
thanks,
right.
Nick.